up. Here we go. On the road. Tunnel in the sun. On up.
Welcome to the Fear and Courage podcast, where we tell the stories of military veterans, law enforcement officers, and first responders. These careers are intense and in many ways foreign to the majority of people. We tell stories with intensity, dramatic personal impact, high physical and emotional stress, and lives change as a result of a career of service. Thanks for listening. Today on the show I have Tim Crockett. Tim's a veteran of the British Royal Marines and Special Boat Service with service in Northern Ireland, the Balkans, and various other international assignments. He then worked as a security consultant for various clients including Turner Broadcasting, Al Jazeera America, Vice, and CNN International. He was instrumental in CNN's acquisition of a VHS tape library that showed Al-Qaeda's chemical gas experiments, terrorist training tactics, and previously unseen images of bin Laden and his top aides in Afghanistan in 2002. He currently works in travel risk management and international medical security and travel assistance. Tim plans to row across the Atlantic Ocean, solo and unassisted, which means he'll not receive any resupply during the 3,000 nautical mile journey. He'll take part in an annual race called the Talisker Whisky Atlantic Challenge, which has been going on for more than 20 years now. That's right, people have been rowing themselves across the Atlantic Ocean for 20 years through sheer force of will. Tim will attempt this amazing feat of human physical and mental endurance at the end of this year in order to raise awareness for veteran suicide and promote the individual connections that truly make the difference for those that are struggling. The Special Boat Service is the elite maritime special forces unit of the United Kingdom Special Forces and is described as the sister unit of the British Army 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, with both of those under the operational control of the Director of Special Forces. The SBS operators tend to come from Royal Marine Commandos, as the SBS was originally organized as a special boat company by the Royal Marines under the United Kingdom's Royal Navy, but the SBS accepts candidates from all services now. They're part of the UKSF along with the Special Air Service, the Special Reconnaissance Regiment, and the Special Forces Support Group. The SBS has around 100 to 200 operators, so it's a small, extremely elite and specialized unit, and they're divided into 4 squadrons, C, X, M, and Z. United Kingdom Special Forces selection, which candidates must pass in order to train to become SBS operators, is one of the most demanding military courses in the world, and has a reported pass rate of less than 10%. Examples of exercises during selection include 5 timed marches with lengths between 14 and 17 miles conducted on consecutive days, followed by a 40-mile endurance march, all with a 60-pound pack, jungle tactics training in Borneo, and extensive tactics and specialty training. Welcome to the show. Many of the guests that I have on the show are friends and former colleagues and people that I've got service experience with specifically. So it's fun to get someone on that, you know, we have no common background and you served in a completely different capacity than anything close to what I did. So
in a different country.
Exactly. Can you give me a little bit of background on how you decided to join the service and
yeah, I was one of those kids that from a very early age, I knew that I was going to go into the military. I didn't know what branch. I had cousins that were in the Air Force. My brother and my father had both served, albeit only a short amount of time. My father was a logistics guy after kind of failing the physical on the parachute side. My brother was in the infantry. But I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. I was perhaps a little bit more of a thinker than most. And something in me said, well, first get yourself a qualification, a trade, something to fall back on just in case the military doesn't suit you. So I first entered into an engineering apprenticeship as a design draftsman in engineering. And after about 2.5 years, was getting bored thoroughly of going to an office. So I wanted to speed things up. And one afternoon, I went down to the Army Careers office. I sort of banged on the door. And I'd actually been doing some more manual work, laying some electrical lines and some pneumatic lines into an outside workshop at the training facility that I was at. And the Army recruiter looked at me with this shovel in my hand and sort of asked what I wanted. And I sort of told him. And he went, really? Really appreciate it, but you sound that you've got something going for you at the moment. Go away for 6 months. If you still feel that way, come back. And I was really deflated, thinking, what the heck? They just turned me down. I'm here at their door, ready to throw myself into service, and they sort of turned me away. So I kind of went back, went out that night with a couple of friends, and a friend of a friend was home on leave from the Marines. And I was sort of chatting to him, and we delved a little bit deeper into what he was doing and the career options available within the Royal Marines. And I thought, hey, they even have what they call an assault engineer. You get to blow stuff up and everything.
that sounds cool.
Exactly. That's for me. So that weekend, in fact, on a Friday, I took off early and decided to head over to the nearest sort of city where there was a Royal Marine recruiting office. Did the same thing, walked in there. They took a quick look at me. I was playing a lot of rugby at the time. They got me to do a few pull-ups, a few physical tests, and they were like, yep, okay. Sat down, did about a 15, 20-minute interview, and said, right, we'll be in touch. And then it kind of set the path for a fairly long road into the Marines. It took almost sort of 12 months before I turned up on the doorstep of Commando Training Center in Lympstone, which was late January 1990. At the time, there were some terrible storms kind of ravaging the south of England, with sort of trees falling on railway lines and flooding and all this sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. So instead of the traditional everyone in that new intake, that new recruit troop, arriving at Exeter, getting on the final train that takes you to Lympstone, everyone was coming in dribs and drabs, 2s and 3s. So it was slightly different. It was a lot more daunting. You had the wind howling, and you're still met by the drill instructor with his kind of trench coat waving in the wind with this stern look on his face, rain dripping down his face. Just
like the movies.
Yeah, exactly. It was just like the movies. And getting collected in small groups and marched up to the induction block where you went through the first 2 weeks of training. So, yeah, I have very vivid memories of those first couple of weeks when I joined.
And so what does the transition from, I guess, the Royal Marines to the Special Boat Service look like? That kind of the decision to move into special operations, and then how do you actually get there?
Well, again, I didn't have the sort of traditional transition, certainly not in length of time. Mm-hmm. I was incredibly fortunate when I passed out of training. So it's in the UK, the Royal Marines, it's 9 months worth of basic training. So it's a long process.
It's quite a while.
But it spits out an incredible product at the end. I myself had passed as the King's Badgeman, so I was the top recruit in that troop that came through.
It's the U.S. equivalent of that as a school's honor graduate, I guess.
I would imagine so, yes. Mm-hmm. So I get to wear the King's Badge, which was sort of bestowed upon the top recruit in the senior troop in training at that time by King George V. And you get to wear that badge on every uniform to every rank, regardless of sort of where you end up in the corps. So it's quite a high honor. And you get afforded sort of a you don't have to go back and do sort of 2 weeks worth of guard duty down at Lympstone when you first pass out. You basically get a week off, and then you spend a week in a recruiting office. So you go back and say, hey, look what happened to me. Come on in. So I again joined my unit after that 2 week period by myself. And I joined 40 Commando, which is based in Taunton in Somerset. And I can remember arriving the day before, thinking, getting a little bit of a head start on that normal joining routine. And my last week in training was the start of the Corps boxing championships. And at the time, I wasn't a boxer. I was a rugby player. But I knew how to fight. I was a brawler more than anything else. And I could take a punch. So I'd perfected the forehead block way ahead of most of my colleagues. So you block a few of those punches with your forehead and then go and knock your opponent out.
Willingness to throw a punch and a strong chin are surprisingly effective tactics.
There you have it. So I'd won the CDC championships, and they wanted me to stay behind to box in the Corps championships. And I politely declined, saying, no, I'm not a boxer. Rugby is my sport. And besides, I need to go join my unit. So they reluctantly let me go. I go away, and I arrive sort of eager to join my unit as a young Marine. And I can remember walking up the main drag, the main road within the camp, getting your sort of stamps on your joining routine. And all of a sudden, there's this big booming Scottish voice behind me, screaming out, "You in the red top, come back here." And I'd literally been on camp less than 20 minutes, and I'm already in trouble. So I go sort of running back, and I stood half attention outside this guy's office, not knowing who he is. And he's like looking at me up and down. He's like, "You boy, get in here." So I walk through the door, turn left to walk in his office, and all of a sudden see that it's the RSM, Regimental Sergeant Major.
That's that'll tighten you up a little bit when you notice that.
Especially this guy's about 6'4", 6'5", a big barrel chest on him, and I'm like, oh no. Literally been here less than 20 minutes, and I'm in the RSM's office getting shouted at.
6'5", barrel-chested Scottish regimental sergeant major.
Yeah, and he again stares at me for a few more seconds, and then he goes, "Have you boxed before?" And I felt my body relax a little bit, and I was like, "Oh, yes, sir. Actually, I just come from Lympstone. I won the CDC championships, but I'm not a boxer. I'm a rugby player." He said, "Be on the bus tomorrow at 7 o'clock." I'm like, no, be on the bus tomorrow at 7 o'clock. And I was like, okay. So I'd been there 20 minutes, and I'm now already given orders to get back on the bus the following morning, having not met my company, any of my colleagues that were in Charlie Company with me, or any other member of the whole unit. And all of a sudden, I'm going to turn up at 7 o'clock in the morning, get back on this bus, not even met any of the other boxing squad, and go back down to Lympstone where I had left. So, and you may think I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent here, but that's sort of how I bumped along for the next 18 months, 2 years. Was on the core boxing squad for a period of time. Left there to go to Norway to do my Arctic warfare training. Came back from there, went back to Norway to a ski instructor's course. That's when Gulf War I started. So went straight from Norway via the UK, less than 24 hours, out to northern Iraq. Kind of got bounced around there for a period of time until it started to get a little bit boring. And there was a request to go back.
So what?
More boxing. Go back for more boxing, and then it was like, right now you're in that period where in the UK military at the time, that if you hadn't sort of specialized, you ran the risk of getting what we call pinged. So there's a certain allotment that people have to go and become a driver, or have to go and become a signaler, a radio operator.
Sure, it's the same thing in the U.S. Army. There's the kind of requirement to fill those recruiter and drill instructor, drill sergeant kind of roles, those non-operational roles where there's a benefit for an operational person being in them just due to experience and personal network and things like that.
Yeah, so I was kind of skirting with getting sucked into one of those roles, which again, that's not why I joined the Marines for.
A similar sentiment among all operational people.
Yeah, so I started to put requests in for, right, I want to do this, I want to do this. And at the time, I wasn't a particularly strong swimmer. I could hold my own, but knew nothing about the Special Boat Service other than kind of the rumors and what you saw briefly on the news, reference sort of the QE2 bomb incident and a few things like that.
And with certain special operations units, what people in the military know is almost more folklore than real data, because there are obviously reasons why most of that's not publicized. So even within the military, though, the certain special operations units, there's just not a whole lot of information circulated throughout the ranks. Yeah.
And to be all honest, I'd been in the unit 5 minutes.
Sure.
I was had been in there 2 years. And typically most guys looking to try out for Special Boat Service may have done 4, 5, 6 years, may have come from a recce platoon. They've been around the block a bit. They've done perhaps a couple of operational tours.
Coming from those sections within their regular units that are a little bit more elite or selective, reconnaissance platoon, or something like that. The folks that were identified from their unit as being exceptional.
Yeah, they've proved themselves, and they've earned a certain amount of respect and obviously the right to go and try out for a more elite unit. I had not, but I'd grown up living in it's a city, but a small town, on the doorstep of the other Special Forces unit in the UK, the Special Air Service. In fact, my father, who owns a coach and travel business, had been ferrying around guys to and from the hills, to and from the airport. My mother, being a nurse, had treated those that had been injured during the Iranian embassy siege. So it's a small, tight-knit town. Most of the kids I'd gone to school with, their fathers had been in the regiment. So I had grown up around these people. So there wasn't really as much mystique around them. They were regular dads, regular human beings from what I could see. Kind of cool, but... and one of the requests that I had put in at the time was to go to the Special Air Service. Only 4 people were allowed each year, 2 on each course from the Marines. Were allowed to sort of cross deck. Were allowed to go and perhaps join an army unit. And I'd put in for one of these requests. Well, it was probably about a week later, just coming in from normal morning PT, and my sergeant major at the time collars me and says, "Crockett, can I have a quick word?" Like, sergeant major ran down, and he, instead of going to his office, he turns left and goes into the store. I went, "Oh, this doesn't look good again." And he had a fairly stern look on his face. And again, he was another fairly large guy, and was in the Special Boat Service. So I thought, I've obviously upset him. I'm going to get another leathering here off the books. So I walk in there, and he sort of sits down on a pile of tents from Norway. And he goes, "Crockett," he says, "I see that you put in to go to Hereford. What's the score there?" And I said to him, "Look, Sergeant Major, I'm kind of getting close to being pinged for a job that I don't want. I know Hereford. Obviously, I'm from Hereford. So I thought, why not?" He said, "Well, why not pool? Why not the SBS?" And I went, "Well, to be honest, I'm not a particularly strong swimmer. And he said, well, you're strong enough to obviously get into the Marines. How much stronger do you think you need to be? And I went, well, I don't really know. So he kind of coached me through, and for the next 45 minutes, an hour, he convinced me that I should at least put my papers in and go on what we call an acquaint. So there are 3 or 4 acquaints that you get to sort of see what life in the SBS is about, and they get to test you physically to see if you can have the aptitude. Because
I would imagine your initial inclination would have been to go to the SAS just because that's what you grew up around, and you knew families, and that was familiar to you.
Yeah, and again, I just didn't know enough about the SBS and what it entailed. I thought you literally grew gills and lived in the water, and
you just became the most deadly frog on the planet.
Exactly. So he convinced me to try it for pool, and there were another couple of little bumps along the way where sort of paperwork got lost, and it ended up me literally having 2 weeks to prepare before going down and going through my aptitude, and I had a rough time.
I would imagine so. To give some frame of reference, many listeners don't have military experience, or especially familiarity with British military units or special operations units. But for selection processes like these, there are people who spend the better part of the prior year preparing for special operations selections, and many of the trials put through at these selection processes are designed to be highly difficult and highly selective. And so 2 weeks to even prepare for an interview for something like that is a small period of time.
Yes.
But to prepare for the entire selection, it's quite daunting.
Yeah. And to put it into perspective, I got 2 weeks advance notice that I was going to go on this aptitude, this acquaint. But obviously I'd come from the Royal Navy boxing squad.
Sure.
I'd been to Norway. So heart and lungs, powerful legs, a certain level of fitness now that I'd put weight back on from after losing it on the boxing squad. Mm-hmm. I was probably at my fittest, even with only two weeks to sort of get very specific, like literally prepare your feet for what was ahead. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that actually was an advantage is that I did not know what happened beyond day 3. I had a good friend of mine that was with me on the aptitude, and he had been as far as day 3 on a previous course before he got injured off. So I was intimately aware of what was sort of coming for the first 3 days, and then for the other week and a half, I knew nothing. And I think that helped because you just basically head down, ass up, and took whatever they threw at you and got through that evolution, got ready for the next one, and just you everything in its stride.
You eat what's on the plate when the plate's put in front of you, basically, and you don't worry about what's coming next. You just handle the situation at hand and move forward. I would imagine not knowing, it eliminates some of the, it could be a blessing and a curse, because it can eliminate some of the oh man, in 4 days we've got a long ruck march and I don't know if I'm going to make it. It eliminates that thought process completely, because you're focused on right now I have to do this, and next time I eat is this, and next time I sleep is this, and those are the 3 things that basically go through your head there.
Yeah. Well, and there was sort of a couple of key moments. Everyone gets trashed. The idea of the training team is that they break you down to the lowest common denominator, whether that's through a mixture of physical activity, pure BS factor, or sleep deprivation, and the combination of all 3 over the course of days. That first week, you would probably cover anywhere between 2 and 250 miles, various marches, orienteering, morning PT, just various different sessions to test everyone's physical capacity for pain and be able to efficiently get from point A to point B. It was on the morning of the 20-mile march. We'd been out all night, which was part of the process, on an orienteering all the way around Poole. And a few folks had taken shortcuts and sort of combined resources. And that following morning, when the training sergeant major sort of found out, he put us through one of the most grueling beasting sessions that I think I've ever experienced. And during that, I pulled some muscles in my lower back and ruptured the bursa in my right hip. And
what you're describing, that is just brutal physical training as a corrective measure for hours on end. Yeah.
Crawling up the main drag on your hands and knees, fireman's carry, just anything and everything thrown at you for a protracted period of time until everyone is broken down to the point of failure. So we got through that, shower changed, and we're on the 4-ton trucks heading out to the start of the 20-mile march. And obviously your body stiffens up. I jumped down off the back of the truck and I immediately noticed something's wrong. But that's obviously not going to stop me. So we start the march, and it's an individual effort. And I think it was probably 3-4 miles into the 20-mile march, and we were all carrying a 65-pound pack and a weapon. And I can hardly walk. I'm like Quasimodo. I'm dragging my right leg behind me. Tears streaming down my face, not through just the pain, but because I'm not going to, I don't see how I can finish this. So I take my pack off and I'm sat there and I'm looking at the map, figuring out like where's the closest road that I got to get myself to get picked up by the safety vehicle. And a guy that was actually in 40 Commander with me, more senior guy, comes up and says, "Oh, what's going on?" I sort of tell him, I said, "Right, tell the staff that I'm going to be down here on this road junction. I'm injured, I can't carry on." He went, No, come on, you can do it. Like, he says, at least get to the next checkpoint, which was about, I don't know, another 2 miles on. So I sort of sat there and contemplated life for about 1 or 2 minutes, kind of slapped myself around, get a grip. And I did just that. I hoisted my pack back on, and I continued to walk like Quasimodo to the next checkpoint in excruciating pain, and got there, went to see one of the directing staff and said, "Look, this has happened. This is what sort of pain I'm in." And he was a short guy from north of England, had been a miner prior to him joining the Marines. His whole family had been miners from a very hard background.
Hard as nails.
We used to call him Corporal Hard Hands. He'd like get a wire brush and scrub his hands after the
That's one of the best. That's one of the best military nicknames I've ever heard. That it's not fancy, but you got somebody with that nickname, not one to be messed with. Yeah. So he said, "Right, okay." He said, "Get to the next checkpoint." He said, "I'll make sure that there's some painkillers there for you." So I was like, big sharp intake of breath. I'm like, okay. I can't remember the distance in between because now it's all a bit of a blur. And it was, all I remember, it was starting to get dark. And it's sort of along the Purbeck, which is the sort of the south coast of the UK, just outside of Poole. And it was coming down into this little town called Corfe Castle. And there's obviously a big castle right in the middle of town. And I'm coming down, and people that started behind me are passing me. And a good friend of mine came past me and sort of gave me some words of encouragement. And I later found out he thought I was never going to make it. When he saw what sort of state I was in, I could basically hardly walk. And he's like, "There's no way this guy's going to finish the last 8 miles of this march, as well as sort of a mile swim out to this landing craft." They had that mile swim on the end there just to remind you what you're trying out for and make it a little more miserable.
Yeah. So I continued. I hobbled my way down into the next checkpoint, and true to form, Corporal Hard Hands was there. Had the little magic pills, popped them, and I take off again. And within about 5 minutes, these painkillers kicked in. And the next thing I know, and this is what I heard from a good friend of mine, the gentleman that passed me on the way down, going uphill now, and it's a very long, it's probably like a 2.5 mile uphill gradient. I pass him running.
At a swift jog.
at a swift jog, as if there's nothing wrong. And he's like,
that has to be.
What just went past me?
Oh, man.
And yeah, once the pain had gone and I was probably slightly spaced out, like powered it all the way through the final, 6-8 miles or so, down to where we were going to swim off the beach to the landing craft, just on some sort of narcotic that he'd given me. And because we were still waiting for the final runners to come in, we sort of get in there, get in your sleeping bag. But I was in such bad shape that literally the guys had to take the pack off me, put me in my sleeping bag, and then when it was time to go, literally drag me out of my sleeping bag, and then we got into obviously the freezing cold water, which was probably the best thing for me at the time, because it was almost like putting a
ice bath
on you. And it took from that morning, it took about 3 months worth of physio between the end of the aptitude to the start of the actual course to repair my body enough to get me through selection. So I felt that the aptitude phase, those 2 weeks, or more importantly, that first week, was more painful than the subsequent kind of 9 months, 12 months worth of selection that I then went through.
Yeah, and something that's a major factor in environments like that. I graduated from Ranger School many moons ago, and I've been through selection processes as well, some successfully and some unsuccessfully. And a major factor for candidates in that environment is there's the drive to succeed, but there's a heavy fear of failure in those environments, because you set out to do something that is held in very high regard. A special operations unit in the military, especially within a military community, is held in very high regard, and you get into the mindset, get ready to go, and you're in your head, you're there to do the job, and you're there to be in that unit. And so there's a lot of fear of failure and concern over not doing well enough or not finishing, and that can drive you through an immense amount of adversity and pain.
Yeah, and I think that was a big part of my story. When I successfully passed the course, I was, the third youngest guy to have passed SBS selection, or the SBS course. The second youngest was actually on my course, a very good friend of mine. And I have since got to know the youngest guy to have ever passed. And we were only sort of separated by, me, the second and third guy were separated by, I think, 3 days, and the other guy by a couple of weeks. And because I'd come from the unit,
And how old were you when you finished the course?
I started it when I was 19 and I finished it when I was 20.
That is remarkably young for that.
Yeah.
And most people in special operations units across English-speaking countries, those that are generally regarded as some of the highest quality or caliber special operations units in the world, Western European countries, the United States, Canada, these units have an average age of late 20s to early to mid 30s, and the reason for that is that many of them require experience in regular conventional units prior to attempting to join and becoming a candidate for those units. But also, you are not at your physical prime for that kind of task at 19 or 20. The 26 to 32-year-old is much better suited for those physical challenges. And so that might sound surprising to some people, considering the youthful exuberance of 19-year-olds and ease of recovery from injury. But in reality, a 27 to 32-year-old infantry soldier or Marine is much better prepared for that kind of selection process than a 19-year-old with a year or two of experience, because it takes your body a long time to get used to long marches under weight, and it takes your body a long time to get used to those sleep deprivation patterns and being able to remain operational through that. So it's there's a reason why people, you're one of the youngest to graduate, and people don't do it at that age very often.
No, it is very rare. Granted, so the intakes now are a lot younger than they were during my time, if we're looking at the averages.
Sure.
But yeah, I think I was definitely an anomaly. Obviously, once you start the course, the first 2 weeks is what we call the initial boating phase, and it's done in kind of World War II era 2-man canoes. And my canoe partner was almost 10 years older than me. So that kind of puts it into perspective. And I would say, other than myself and Carl, the others were at least 5-6 years older than he and I. And that in a regular unit can be quite intimidating.
Sure.
Like I said, to be going into one of the most elite units in the world, you really do have to sort of double down. I think the fear of failure, and not so much personal failure. I think it's because obviously very early on you learn the value of working in small teams. It's letting down your teammates.
Absolutely. That's got an exponentially more difficult. It's an exponentially more difficult thing to deal with, because letting yourself down, you can get past that. You can get up the next day and move on. But when you let other people down that have dedicated themselves to, being on the team with you, that the kind of impact, that's probably one of the biggest fears anyone in any military unit holds, is letting down the team. I think that's pretty consistent. Number one fear is let down the team, especially in a way that could cause someone to be injured.
Yeah. And I think reflecting back on it now, you see those that didn't make it through perhaps the jungle phase is because they were team players to a certain amount, but they didn't put the team ahead of themselves. And again, the way that the training is structured, that if you're not a team player, because everyone has good days and bad days, and during those bad periods or bad days, you need your teammates to pick you up and carry you through. And if they don't feel that you would do the same for them, then they can easily sort of let you struggle a little bit more, a little bit longer. And it doesn't take much. It's a cumulative sort of effect that you get to a point where
there's a breaking
you have
point.
enough, and they'll pull themselves off.
And there's consistency in successful organizations across the world in members of the organization putting the organizational goals first. That's a pretty obvious factor in successful organizations, but in military units, that concept of putting organizational goals or the mission first, the team first, is absolutely essential to success the more contentious and difficult the military task gets. And so in special operations units, in operational airborne infantry units, in Marine infantry units, the job becomes difficult and complex enough so that factor of everyone on the team putting the team and the mission first, if any person in that team is off on that, you risk mission failure. And so that's an ideal that is pushed with significant priority, I think, in really any operational military unit, but the more contentious and difficult the task, the more important that aspect is.
Absolutely.
But so how long was that SBS course? Did you say it was around, I know you mentioned that basic training was 9 months. Did you say that was also around 9 months?
It is, yes. I think when did we all turn out? So we all sort of appear down at Poole late June, and you sort of, I think, finally, depending on whether you're parachute trained or not, you'll finally join your squadron. I think end of February, May time the following year.
So what? I think we could probably spend 3 hours talking about that 9 months and the details of every bit of training that you did. But when you finish that, you're essentially kind of certified to join a team. And what does that look like?
That's correct. The way the course was structured when I went through is that when you essentially are badged and you can drink sort of twice your body weight in Guinness, then you're ready to join your squadron. And my first squadron, it was C Squadron, which was sort of the green squadron at the time. And you're ready to join a team and kind of assimilate. And at those sort of points, the unit as a whole looks at everyone, sort of where everyone is rank-wise, qualification-wise, and each fighting squadron has certain requirements in terms of number of medics, number of linguists, number of demolition guys, etc., etc., etc. So what would happen is you join your squadron, your troop, and your team, and then you may get given an infiltration skill or another qual to go and attain. And mine was the patrol medic. So shortly after joining, I then went off to become a patrol medic, which was another 10-week course to go and learn how to patch people up to a fairly high level. And a great skill to have, which one which I've managed to maintain my entire career, and that in itself has led to many more stories of sort of the scrapes that you can get into.
Sure, when you're the guy that can patch people up in a special operations unit, you tend to stay pretty busy. Yeah. Whether those injuries are operational or training or whatever it is, people out there getting after it get hurt.
Yeah, and the classic sort of hearts and minds as well, being able to go into an area and set up a little mini clinic and work at helping the local population with one ailment or another. So that was great. I loved that. Both my older sister and mother were nurses. I'd always had an interest in medicine. Nowhere near smart enough to go off and become a doctor, but enough to sort of become a medic and be able to, like I said, patch people up. And
yeah, that's and to give an idea of kind of how the Special Boat Service is organized, there's 4 squadrons, correct?
There is now 4 squadrons, and it's previously, because of the high sort of specialized nature of what we did in terms of the maritime counterterrorism work. M Squadron was very intense and very busy at the time, and we did a lot of drug interdiction work. So you typically would join a squadron for a 2-year period because of the training and requirements of the subspecialization and needs of the job at the time. Now, because of the operational tempo, because of the war on terror, they've developed more into perhaps more US-like in the way it's structured and very much in line with that of our counterparts up in Hereford. So there are 4 squadrons Typically, you would join a squadron and stick with that squadron, and the requirement or the role of the squadron would actually now change. So instead of changing to go to that squadron and specialize in whether it's maritime kind of terrorism or support or green, now you stick with the squadron, and the squadron's role rotates around the four operational fields. So that change happened after I'd left.
So it used to be much more kind of individuals moving around squadron to squadron, gaining different operational tasks and specialties. And now with the deployment cycle as the major driving force of, what unit is going and what unit is coming back and what unit is there. And they rotate, and it's C, Z, M, and X, right? For Correct, the four squadrons. And so they rotate into, C squadron may be assigned the Afghanistan role for this period of time, and M squadron is assigned, whatever it is, a maritime counterterrorism role or something like that. And they kind of rotate through those different roles, correct?
That's right, yes.
Okay. And so for you, that was, you were kind of joining and going through the medic training and joining your team, and this is in the early to mid 90s, correct?
Yeah, so this was 92. C Squadron. I think we had a few sort of minor deployments, the normal sort of training exercises, and then
what do those normal sort of training exercises look like in the SBS?
They vary from kind of smaller troop level involvement. We would do obviously a lot of support of our friends up the road, whether that was in Northern Ireland on those sort of operations, or in support of the general sort of NATO interests. We would train with our counterparts in Greece, in Germany, in the US, any of our friendly NATO partners.
There's a remarkable amount of exchange in those training exercises.
Because typically there are very few real operational needs at that time that didn't touch one or more of our sort of NATO partners or countries that we had a close working arrangement with. So we would exercise.
There's a long history, even more so, significantly more so in special operations of international forces working together. I mean, in the war on terror in Afghanistan, initially, the SAS and SBS fell under Joint Special Operations Command, United States Joint Special Operations Command, for the invasion in 2001.
Yeah, very early on. Actually, it was a number of my close friends that were some of the first on the ground and maintained that footprint still to today.
And so there's that long history of cross training with country to country and working on operations together and falling under one another when it comes to chain of command. There are many U.S. units that fell under the UK units in Helmand province, and so there's a lot of benefit to that as well, because different organizations have different assets and different training facilities and methodologies and best practices and experience, and so there's a very healthy exchange there.
And you can't sort of learn those in theater. It's got to be ingrained.
Hopefully not, right?
Prior to that, even if there's some obviously operational tweaks that need to be made in theater, the basis of any sort of relationship needs to be built over time. So we actually do have a permanent exchange with our maritime counterparts here in the US, and the same with those in Australia. So we typically will send some folks over there, and they'll send some folks with us, and they'll be with us for a 2-year period. And then those shared learnings in different methodologies, in whether it's maritime techniques, whether it's demolitions, whether it's close quarter battle, again, we'll go back and forth. So it's always getting refined. So then when you do find yourself in a situation where whether it's intentional, you're basically going to kick a door in and go in a mixed team, or whether it's as a result of contact with the enemy, and you've had to form a composite team that everybody knows when you go through this door what role you're playing and what certain hand signals are going to mean, and what's the sort of line of communications and all those sort of important things when lead's flying around.
Yeah, and to break that down a little bit more, that dynamic, if for our listener, if you imagine a 4-man team entering a room, something as simple as that, one of the most simple and basic, theoretically, military operations is a 4-man team entering and clearing a room. In reality, that's incredibly complex, and because there are simple decisions that have to be made that can't be decisions in the moment. They just have to happen. Like something as simple as, is the first guy going left or right? And there are standard operating procedures that are in place. Most units in that case, the first guy is going to the path of least resistance when he enters the room. But, somebody has to tell you, guy number 1 goes the path of least resistance, and guy number 2 goes the opposite direction, and you have responsibilities for fields of fire, and you move to points of domination in the room, and all of those things are standard operating procedures. When you do this with your buddies in your unit, you kind of take for granted because you've done it with them 2,000 times. You put masking tape down on the floor to make an invisible room, and then you did it in some rooms in the barracks together, and that you have to work on that to understand those standard operating procedures and do it to the point where it is muscle memory and everyone knows. Mm-hmm. But then if you mix the team, that you have to do it again and get on the same page. And then imagine, going so extreme as not just pulling an Army soldier, an airman, a sailor, and putting him in a team like that. That's crazy in and of itself. But people from different countries find themselves on operations where you have a mixed team, not just across units or services, but across countries. And to be able to pull off that operation successfully, those standard operating procedures, those simple things that need to be muscle memory and not decisions, have to be understood to the man. And that takes an incredible amount of time and cross-training and communication and experience, unit to unit and service to service. Just for that simple who goes left and who goes right decision to work out.
Exactly. The basics.
So what did life in the Special Boat Service look like on a kind of a daily or weekly basis? I'm personally curious, what does a day of training look like? How do you get to be proficient at your battle drills and tasks?
I think to be honest, it's not that glamorous. It's certainly not the way Hollywood would sometimes portray it. I think the movies have got a lot better.
Every day is not explosions, Guinness, and machine guns?
No, not every day. But it's the basics done really, really well and done a lot. Like you said, it's that repetition. I think one of the things that sets us apart, yes, we get to play with some real, what we would call Gucci kit or more specialized equipment.
All the fancy fun toys.
Yeah. Was the allocation of training resources, right? Time on the range, ammunition to train on the range. That's how you become proficient. That's how you become almost perfect in these drills, is because you've made so many more mistakes and then you've learned from those mistakes because of time on the range, the amount of exercises that you get to go on, the amount of times you jump out of a plane, all these sort of things that the sort of regular Army or other units don't get to sort of play with, and certainly not at that sort of level. So regardless of sort of what squadron you're in, you're just doing an incredible amount of practice, and you try to make everything that you do specific to the job that you're doing at the time, even like morning PT. So in M Squadron, when I was there, which it was a maritime counterterrorism role, we would be in the water diving at least 2 weeks, if not 3 weeks out of the month. PD would be a lot of cardiovascular training, running, circuits, swim training, But after every session, you would finish with a heavy dose of pull-ups and dips, even practicing technique up a caving ladder, because when you throw on 70, 90 pounds worth of equipment and then have to climb 60, 70, 80 foot up a caving ladder in 20, 30 foot swells in the North Sea after having swum onto a target from about a mile away, you got to make sure that your technique is perfect and that you have the upper body strength to haul yourself up out of the water, and then eventually up the ladder onto the target. So that's just getting to do your day job. That's your commute. So that's sort of what you want. You can only build that amount of training in if you're doing it all the time.
Sure.
And then if anyone sort of struggles in any of those areas, you'll find them quite often in the evening. They'll head back down to the hangar or to the gym, and they're going up and down that ladder. They're going up and down the ropes.
There's a heavy dose of personal responsibility in those environments where you don't have to be told to train. You know what the desired end state is, and you'll get yourself there, whether it's scheduled unit training or stuff you have to do on your own.
Yeah, and going back and visiting the unit since I've left, and practically the whole unit's been rebuilt, and you see how more scientific and specialized they've become about training. Like since I left, the advent of CrossFit has come around.
High intensity, just that focus on high intensity. But one thing I don't want to miss before we move on is if anyone listens to this podcast on their commute, I think that we should note it's most likely a simpler commute or an easier commute than a 1 mile swim through the North Sea through freezing cold water to get to a caving ladder. They may be a little bit more comfortable with their coffee and their cup holder on that commute. That's seems a bit daunting to jump in freezing cold water in the North Sea and swim a mile.
Yeah, that was obviously one of our requirements, was sort of the defense of the oil installations, not just in the North Sea, but anywhere in the world that were UK assets. And something else.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I say we always used to have a lot of fun. The guys that work on those platforms know them intimately, and they were very accommodating to let a load of kind of military guys come around and climb all over their installation and kind of mess with their normal working day, and sometimes skirt kind of the what would be OSHA or health and safety rules in order to practice, because they knew if something happened and God forbid one of these platforms were taken over by terrorists, that it would be us that would be coming in to help them out.
They had a very specific personal interest in doing everything they could to make sure that you got the training needed.
Yeah.
And so something I wanted to touch on as well is you mentioned that really what makes people in these environments experts is doing the same simple tasks just extremely, extremely well. And that I believe is a consistent theme through a number of different things. I've trained martial arts for a long time, and in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the best black belts in the world, they're not doing anything different. They don't have their own special techniques. They're just doing the same base level techniques with a degree of proficiency that's unmatched. And that's the same thing that special operations units are doing. Firing a projectile out of a weapon is the same process basically every single time it happens, but the ability for someone to do that and with a level of precision and accuracy that's near perfection takes many, many, many tens of thousands of iterations of that, and you have to fail a bunch and make corrections a bunch to get to that point. And I think the second aspect of that is that the allowable or accepted margin of error in training is much, much smaller in special operations units or units with a higher standard of training and execution. You know, if you'll accept 1 millimeter in deviation for where your rounds land on the target, then you'll probably have deviations in the millimeters. But if you accept 1 foot in where your rounds land on the target as a deviation, then you're going to have errors that are measured in feet. You know, the concept of aim small, miss small is also kind of universal in that environment. Yeah. So it's that selection process of getting the right people there, and then the repetition of those base level tasks to the point of extreme expertise, which takes funding. And then the mentality or the mindset of accepting extremely low variation or error with extremely tight tolerances. That aim small, miss small mentality kind of gets everyone to the point. They've got the assets, the time, and the training resources. They've got the environment and the mentality where there's a level of repetition and error correction that's pretty extreme. And then also that mentality of a very low level of acceptance for deviations and errors. And you kind of put that all together, and what you get is a very, very polished product, a very technically proficient result.
Yeah.
And so how long did you serve in the Special Boat Service?
I was there 10 years. Came out in March 2001.
And so other than, you know, training and that mission of protecting kind of oil rigs and assets in the North Sea as well as elsewhere, what other kind of operational requirements did you have in that 10-year period?
Several, like I said, went from Sea Squadron. The tail end of my first stint within Sea Squadron, the conflict in the Balkans erupted, and a small group of us went off and got our blue berets, and were Joint Commission officers within the UN contingent out there during the actual war. And I was assigned to sectors sort of northeast that had Srebrenica, Tuzla, and kind of a lot of the Scandinavian troops up there. So I was actually out there for 7 months as part of the Balkans campaign. They saw a bit of time up there, and again we're looking at close air support, get medics, languages, diplomacy, a lot of reporting back information. So typically our role was, there was a team of JCOs sent to each of the segments or sectors.
Those joint commissioned UN officers.
Yeah. So we were there in an overt kind of special forces role, which meant that when something happened, we would go to that area, set up secure communications back to the UN commander in Sarajevo and say, this is happening. So if the Serbs were bombing a village, we would report back, and then obviously they would decide on a course of action. And if that then required calling in fast jets for an airstrike to neutralize the threat, that's pretty much kind of what we did.
And that surveillance, reconnaissance, and then support and influence kind of mission is one of those primary missions of special operations units in the SBS. The direct action, offensive action stuff is what most people think of, but surveillance reconnaissance is one of the principal roles of the SBS, and a lot of the time that's a lot of sitting and looking and not a lot of shooting.
Yeah, that traditionally that has been the primary role of most SF units, is that you're there to surveil something, report back, which then may lead to some sort of direct action. Because you need to sort of find out where the threat is, find out where the bad guys are before you can really do anything. So yeah, that's what we were doing out there for a period of time. We were there during the fall of Srebrenica, and then we left, and within a couple of months after kind of the ceasefire was declared, and then obviously the US moved in, took control and kind of managed the aftermath of the conflict. Kind of bounced around M Squadron, back and forth on a few things, and then, funnily enough, the tail end of my time in M Squadron, I got approached by the Sergeant Major again.
This is the same Scottish barrel-chested Sergeant Major?
No.
Okay.
Different gentleman this time. I always seem
different guy, same role.
Pulled in by the Sergeant Major, or pulled to one side. He didn't actually pull me into the storeroom this time. And there was an incident that happened upon selection. And at this time, I think this was either the first or second sort of rotation, where previously you had the SBS and the SAS, and they did their own thing. They ran their own selection process, ran their own training, and effectively ran their own units. And again, the SBS kind of administered by the Royal Marines, which in turn is administered by the Royal Navy. The SAS, they're kind of like the pinnacle, the best unit within the Army. And they actually report into Director Special Forces. So at the time, there was a lot of things changing, and talk that for the survivability of both units and the role within the UK military, that there was talk of amalgamation, of joining these units, much the same way a lot of other units around the country were losing their identity. Some units were disappearing, some were getting merged.
That's contentious stuff too, because while there are organizational conveniences, you can't underestimate the power of unit history and tradition.
Absolutely. And again, at the moment, the Royal Marines are potentially under the knife again. And the last time they were getting scrutinized at this level because was just before the Falklands. And the Falklands conflict sort of proved the value of having an amphibious fighting force. So anyway, we were in that sort of state, and there was now a joint training team where you had, I think it was 8 instructors from the SAS ranks and 4 instructors from the SBS ranks. They formed the training team that took through joint SF selection. So the first 24 weeks of UK Special Forces training now, everyone is going through the same curriculum. And then at that point, they would separate, and those that were coming to Poole would then learn their boating and diving skills, and those that were going to Hereford would continue with their skill track. Well, one of the guys from Poole had a medical issue on one of the marches. And the Sergeant Major came to me and said, "Hey, Crockett, one of the guys has a problem. We need to sort of replace him quickly. You fancy going up there and taking his role, his position?" And I'm like, "Why?" "Well, you're from Hereford." I'm like, "Well, yeah, but I live here now." And he sort of got rocked back a little bit. And then he went, "Well, obviously this would help with seniority and advancement. Come back, he'd be on a ones course and a SC1's course, which is sort of a qualifying course tied to rank and as a sergeant." So I was like, "Oh, okay, I like the sound of that. Tell me more." Anyway, long story short, I did go up and become a member of the Joint SF training team, and it was a job that never appealed to me. When I went through the process myself, and we were there, sort of quaffing a few cold Guinnesses back, patting ourselves on the back, I went, "Yeah, that's a job that I would hate. I would never want to do that job." I'd go and sit in the back of an SDV, which is the little mini sub, sooner than I would join the training team. But I went up there, and I think it was because of the team of guys that I joined. And again, it comes back to that ability to trust the people that you're with at every level and in every situation. I kind of like assimilated really, really quickly. And actually found that I enjoyed being part of that team in that training instructor role. And I sort of, other than finishing with a language course, that was the sort of last real major role that I had within the SBS before I left. And in fact, I did an extra 6 months within that role to allow one of the other guys to come back early to go on a parachuting course, a freefall course, because I was at the time sort of enjoying it, and it meant quite a bit of time away from home. Over that 2.5 year period, I spent well over 6 months actually in the jungle. Of all the environments that we work in, I'm very much at home in the jungle.
So what jungle was that? Because I don't know of very many in the UK.
That is true. We would spend the training in Brunei. Okay. In Malaysia.
That is definitely a jungle.
and of all the jungles that you could be in, it's a great learning environment because it's a primary jungle, so it has a very high canopy. It's fairly dry in the sense that the ground, other than yes, it rains every day, it's fairly firm underfoot, and you can, in a very compact area, you can get to do everything. So while yes, you are learning jungle warfare techniques or teaching the students jungle warfare techniques, what you're laying down in terms of baseline SOPs, like we talked about, arcs of fire and knowing how to be around others with weapons, you learn that in the jungle, and it then translates into a mud shack in Africa or Afghanistan, or a high-rise building in central London. You learn the basics in the trees, and that's what I love about the place, is that you can fire in just about any direction. You don't have to walk that far to get a physical workout, yes, or to be navigationally embarrassed. Yet once you become fairly proficient and confident in the environment, you can essentially live there with very little support.
There are two. There's another, a little bit, obviously different than that. But the jungle and the cold are two environments that are very unnatural, seemingly, for people to be in, especially alone and unsupported. But once you gain that specialty and that expertise and that comfort in those environments, you can live remarkably well if you know what you're doing. But the jungle provides some adversity in simple things like keeping your feet dry and dealing with animals and insects and just all of the seemingly small but could become a very big problem quickly kind of threats.
Yeah. Well, the first one about keeping your feet dry, you can't. You just need to know how to maintain them and stop them from falling off. And I think that's one of the first lessons that you need to sort of come to terms with. But it's never so cold that you're going to kind of die of hypothermia. Mm-hmm. Yes, there are things out there that can kill you and can kill you fairly bad, in a bad way. But you can literally survive with what's on your back. I would take the jungle over the Arctic any day of the year. That's
a healthy debate, though, among different people of differing backgrounds and experiences.
It is. It's just so much more effort goes into being able to survive in colder climes mm-hmm. than in the jungle. But yes, I've spent a fair amount of time in both environments, and my vote is the jungle.
I think my vote lands firmly in warmer weather as well. I went to.
Don't get me wrong. A beach with a nice sort of cocktail with an umbrella in and a hammock with a bit of shade probably trumps them both.
That's going to come out on top. Huh?
There's not many there's not much requirement for a military force to be camped out and trained on a tropical beach.
Yeah. So after the SBS, what came next for you? And we can kind of talk about what led you from the end of your time in the SBS to where you are now with your current focus.
Yeah. So my choice to leave, because I loved it. Don't get me wrong; it was a very, very tough decision for me to leave when I did. But partly because I had joined and been successful in joining the SBS at such a young age, I'd been very, very fortunate to experience a lot during the 10 years that I was there. But I was still young, and I was still at that sort of career point where if I didn't get the next kind of step up in the next challenges, I would have had to sort of mark time because it's such a small unit and because it's so specialized. The opportunity for career advancement is obviously a little bit more stunted. And when I had agreed to go to Hereford and join the training team, it was sort of under the idea that I was going to then come back in 2 years' time, go on the next career advancement, and then obviously that opens more doors. That didn't happen. It didn't happen because of a clerical error. And I think there's about 6 of us that fell foul of this clerical error. And it was because when our administration moved from the Navy to DSF, some personal files sort of got lost, and I was one of those files. And the CEO at the time was very upfront, and so he sort of walked me through it. And it was at that point where I'm like, well, I'm still young enough to have a second career. So I've done everything that I wanted to do in the service. And at the time, like I said, this was before 9/11. The operational tempo was a lot lower than it is today. The opportunity to learn new skills, do more things, were now becoming more and more sort of limited. So I thought, I will leave with 12 years of happy memories and go on and have a second career. Not knowing what that second career would be, because at the time, there are very few transferable skills. You didn't have a certificate in underwater knife fighting that you could sort of go to a civilian employer and say, hey, look what I can do, give me a job. Yes, there are the skills that you have in terms of man management and all the normal sort of things that you come with being in the military, but not a piece of paper. There's no qualification that would transfer across. Yeah,
there's not something that says we certify that you are capable of doing this civilian job. It doesn't always provide, especially from operational units, infantry units. It doesn't always provide the easiest kind of dovetailed transition to a job.
Yeah. So I left. I thought, right, what I'll do is I'll give myself a good 12 months to figure out what I want to do next. And I'll sample all these other opportunities out there. I didn't really want to go into the close protection field where you're just basically staring at an elevator or babysitting some high net worth individual.
Sure, I guess that's the only direct transition is that security stuff. But
yeah, I wanted something a little bit more cerebral. So I came out and I was sampling a few other bits and pieces, and I started doing a bit of counter-piracy work off the west coast of Africa and throughout the Malacca Straits for a telecommunications company that was laying big fiber optic cables. Actually, it started in Portugal, came all the way down the coast of Africa, and then across to India, and then went from the Nicobar Islands all the way down the Malacca Straits. So I got brought on the first phase through the colourful area of West Africa, from Côte d'Ivoire all the way down to Gabon, through Nigerian waters and so forth. and did really well. The company was very pleased with what I did, and they invited me back for the second phase as a project manager. So I'm actually set up and managed the project from the Nicobar Islands in the Indian Ocean down the Malacca Straits into Singapore, liaising with the Indonesian government, the Singaporean government, the Malaysian government. So it took things to a high level. And I could see myself gravitating more to project management with an emphasis on security. And I was loving it. I was having to use my skills, but not in the traditional sense. It was exercising the grey matter. I was still traveling. It was all good. And at the time, I was sort of scheduled to take over a demining operation on the Iran-Iraq border for a Japanese oil company when 9/11 happened. And I can remember being back at home looking for antiques in a local sort of market. And there was that strange buzz in the room, sort of in the street. I didn't know what was going on. There's no TVs anywhere. In fact, I walked up to the owner of the shop and said, "What's going on?" And he said, "A plane has crashed into World Trade Center." I was like, "Oh my goodness!" Drove home, and it took about 40 minutes or so to drive home. Well, within that time, obviously the second plane had hit. Straight away, this is not an accident. And at that point, the brain had already started to kick into overdrive. And within a couple of days, the phone was ringing. And I was asked to go and look after a project in Indonesia for an oil and gas company. Arrived in Jakarta, and while I was there, obviously the planes had gone in to start bombing Afghanistan, and the place just erupted. And it was an American company, so they literally just sent everyone home, mothballed the project, and I was sent home unemployed. So I'm thinking, well, what am I going to do next? My plans on becoming this project manager and going off and doing these cool jobs are starting to evaporate. And went back to the UK, and while just filling in, I was actually looking after Pat Cash at a classic tennis tournament, babysitting a high net worth individual, which I said I wouldn't do, but it was a bit of fun. And a friend of mine came up to me and said, "Hey, do you know such and such?" I went, "Oh yeah, kind of. He's looking for someone to go to Afghanistan to look after a bunch of journalists. You've done some work with the media. Why don't you give him a call?" Well, yeah, that sounds pretty cool. And I had this interest in Afghanistan prior to that. I think I might have mentioned before we got on, my family's business has been in coach and travel. My grandfather set it up, so for nearly 70 years. Mm-hmm. The Crockett family in the UK has been involved in coach and travel. So I've always had this interest in travel and far-flung places, and from a very early age, done a lot of traveling. So I had this interest. I thought, Afghanistan, great, always wanted to go. Didn't really think of the sort of context. And I'd done quite a bit of work with the BBC on a couple of different projects. So I thought, hey, how hard could it really be? Gave this guy a call, met him 2 days later, 10 days later, I'm in Afghanistan. And
welcome to the job.
There you go. And the company was CNN, and I don't think we've let the listeners know. I now live in Atlanta, and what brought me here was working with CNN at the time. And I was out in Afghanistan to look after the CNN crew that was there. And that, again, I was very fortunate to initially work with a fantastic correspondent, international correspondent based out of the UK, incredible go-getter. Had been in Baghdad for the first Gulf War, then as a satellite engineer, now as a correspondent. And we went everywhere. We did the 4 points of the compass. We drove pretty much up and down the country. Went as far north as the Salang Pass, Ghazni, Gardez, Kandahar, Herat, all of them.
What kind of security did you have driving around?
Me.
Yeah, so that's a hell of a thing. Job. That's a hell of a thing. And just to provide a little personal experience, I've spent 2 years of my life in Afghanistan, and the only real road is Highway 1. There's not road. You got to use that term road carefully when you're talking to people who generally live in developed nations, because what we're really talking about is the cleared space in between buildings that's designated for vehicles. Calling it a road in many cases is not exactly accurate, but also when you don't look like the people and you're driving around on the roads in Afghanistan, especially, between 2004 and 2010, that's a highly dangerous situation. Depending on where you are, you get a little bit too far northeast and you're in trouble. You get a little bit caught out in the wind in Kandahar or Ghazni or some of those other places, and it can get very lonely and very dangerous very quickly.
Yeah. So that was the reason why I was there. Now, again, to put it into perspective, it was obviously no longer under the Taliban rule.
Sure.
And it hadn't, and a full insurgency hadn't started to set in. So we were in that grace period of mid to late 2002 to mid 2003.
So you had the benefit of the full IED threat on the roads not really being in place yet.
Exactly. They hadn't quite got into sort of targeting vehicles with IEDs. A few sort of grenade attacks would take place in some of the guest houses, but we had our own villa. We had a fairly secure location. And then it was more sort of covert practices in terms of moving around. So we were very careful with how we moved around and where we moved around. And again, some old basic tradecraft as opposed to driving around with a vehicle with a big TV news on the side.
Yeah.
But it was great. And again, the correspondent, the cameraman or the cameramen and camera woman at the time as well, were all seasoned professionals, great bunch of people. And for about, like I said, 5-6 weeks, we bounced around the place, did some fantastic stories, met some great people. And then it was towards the end of that 6-week period. It was a quiet day, and again, I developed some great friendships with the Afghans that were working for us. My driver, the villa staff, and a few of the other folks. So when there wasn't any news gathering going on, I would spend time with them. I was one of these that if you invest in them, you get greater loyalty, greater support from them. They're more likely going to bail you out of a tight spot than just say, hey.
It's a security factor.
So there's a degree of security in that. So I would always teach him defensive driving. I would teach him how to deal with a gunshot wound, how to deal with a number of different situations that we could find themselves in. And if I was the person that was injured, at least I knew that there were 2 or 3 other people within our vehicles that could patch me up enough to get me back to somewhere safe that could treat me. So it worked. Hey, they got to develop a rapport with me, and I developed a degree of trust in them. So it was a quiet day, and I was away from the sort of the compound for most of the day. Came back, and I got introduced to this young Afghani photographer, and he must have been no more than 17, 18, if that. Looked a lot younger, The correspondent introduced me to him, said hello, told nothing more of it. That evening, I was up, kind of doing the accounts for the house, which is another one of my thrilling roles. And the correspondent and the producer walk in my room, close the door, and lock it. So again, it was that same feeling when getting summoned into the Sergeant Major's office. They come in, stern looks on their face, sit down. I went, oh, what have I done now? And Nick, the correspondent, starts talking to me. He says, that cameraman that we introduced you today, what do you think of him? Nice enough guy. Didn't really have much of a conversation, but he seemed pleasant enough. He sideways look at John and back at me. He said, well, he's come to us with this prospect that he's from Kandahar, and they've come across these tapes. I'm like, I scoot my chair around. Tapes? What do you mean tapes? VHS tapes. I'm like, okay. And we believe, or he has led us to believe, that these are of a certain amount of journalistic value, and we would like to take a look at them. I'm like, okay. And I'm
this whole time you're thinking, what do I have to do with this?
Exactly. I'm sort of trying to tease this out. I don't want to put words in their mouth. And again, it's these nervous looks back and forth. And this was...
What do you want me to do here?
Yeah, this was not long after, obviously, the Daniel Pearl killing. And they were close to Marianne and Daniel. And basically...
And he was killed in 2002.
Correct.
Kidnapped by terrorists and then murdered in Pakistan afterwards. This was a big incident at the time. And he was a Wall Street Journal journalist,
That's
like
right.
this, lots of publicity, and it was a significant threat identified at the time when this happened. Yeah.
And the backstory was that, and Daniel, he was very cautious and safe and methodical in how he did his news gathering and worked with his sources. And the feeling was that he got duped and got suckered into a situation where obviously he was captured and then subsequently killed. So the feeling was, is this now happening to us? Are we getting set up and getting lulled into a situation where they're going to grab another Western journalist? And the thought process, well, if it is, let's send Tim instead. He'll know what to do.
There's some logic in that, but it's not fun when it's you.
Yeah, and I must admit, I was kind of like half laughing because I'm making them squirm, and Nick and John are not individuals that you get to see squirm all that often. So I'm making them squirm, knowing where this is going. And he's saying, well, yeah, we want to get these sort of tapes. I said, well, where are they? And like, in Kandahar. I went, and, well, we're concerned that it's perhaps a setup, but we still want to go and have a look at them. And I'm like, and, well, would you be willing to go down there and check them out? And then if they're genuine, then we'll figure it out from there. I said, okay, yes, I'll go and check them out. I said, but we do it my way. I have full control of the whole situation. And what I say sort of goes regardless. And they're like, yes. So 2 days later, make that arduous 16-hour drive from Kabul all the way down to Kandahar, across the southern deserts, with somebody punching you in the kidney all the way. I met with this young Afghani in the local guest house, and at the time, there were still elements of the Taliban in Kandahar. You could clearly sort of pick them out walking up the street. Mm-hmm. They just weren't carrying weapons. So we knew we only had a limited amount of time in town. So walked in. We had a cover story with a local landlord of a house that CNN used to rent. Went and dealt with all that. So we had a sort of a legitimate reason to be there. And then that evening, I went and met with the young Afghani kid, went to his uncle's house, which was sort of in the eastern side, the old Russian part of Kandahar. And walk in, room, traditional sort of Afghan setup, and 2 small TVs and VCRs in the corner, and this big cloth bag. And he opens up the cloth bag, and there are around about 250, 260 VHS tapes. And we just divided them up, put them in, start scrolling through. And it was the second tape that I put in that was the chemical testing on dogs that the Taliban had been doing. And it was clear that the tapes were genuine. And I think we've admitted that these tapes had come actually from a property that bin Laden had been known to frequent. It had been bombed by the coalition and then looted by 4 individuals. And then as things had moved on, these individuals had got together and realized, hey, we may be able to get some money for these tapes. And then had used the young Afghan kid as an intermediary to sort of reach out to the Western media. And that kid had known the correspondent that was working with me. So we spent the rest of the night going through, and we sort of weaned it down to, I think, about 57 tapes. Those 57 tapes made their way back to Atlanta and went on to become the Terror on Tape series that the network had won a number of awards for.
Yeah, this is a major news break in 2002, right? I think that's
correct. Yeah,
and
2002.
So from what I remember of this, the testing was basically guys in this traditional. The video was guys in this traditional clothing, and they were dropping stuff on the floor with tied up dogs in a room.
Yep.
And and then the video showed these animals experiencing symptoms from some chemical, and I don't know if it was ever identified what it was, but this is a major news event that gave these tapes turned out to be a major intelligence source, and were significant news in I guess the second half of 2002 there.
Yeah. So those tapes, we get them back to Kabul. Correspondent bundles them up, and they make their way to Atlanta. And I go back to my day job in Kabul. New correspondent comes in. We start getting his stories lined up and so forth. Well, it's about a week later. I get a phone call from Atlanta, and it's the correspondent again, Nick. And he's saying, the tapes. I'm like, yeah. Well, one or two of the tapes that came back, someone has scrolled all the way through them in slow time. And what they had found, basically, we'd come across dozens of old Western B movies, and spliced in the middle literally would be an instructional video shot on a home movie camera of how to put a SAM-7 shoulder-launched rocket together. And previous documents that had come into their possession had kind of classroom books and notes of students that had obviously been watching something similar. And what they'd found was almost kind of the curriculum of how to be a terrorist, from instructors' notes to student written notes, and now instructional videos. So it was like, we want the rest of the tapes. I'm like, so
yeah,
you want me to go back to Kandahar and get the other 160 some odd tapes,
and doing the same mission a second time is exponentially more dangerous. Always, yes. Every time. It is something that military units generally do not do.
Yeah. And this was sort of on a Wednesday or Thursday, if I recall. And it was that following Sunday, that Nick caveated it by saying, whatever you do, you need to be out of Kandahar by Sunday around about lunchtime, because that's the first time they're going to air the first episode, which happened to be the dog video. Now, at the time, you couldn't get CNN International in Afghanistan, but you could in Pakistan. And obviously Quetta, the border town, the closest border town to Kandahar, was very, very close. So his concern was someone would see the episode, get spooked, or hear of the rumor that some other Westerner was poking around, talking tapes in Kandahar at the same time, and one thing could lead to the other. So I was like, yeah, okay, we'll get this sorted. So I had to quickly get back down there, concoct a whole new sort of story, get straight in there, find these 4 individuals again, get them all together, and try and get all or the majority of these tapes again, which we kind of did very, very quickly, actually, over a 2-day period. But in doing so, we also got offered, hey, there's these other 11 tapes that so-called document bin Laden's departure from Kandahar and his travel to Tora Bora, if you're interested in those as well. And I probably had spent too much time around journalists by that point, and thought, oh, that sounds like a good story. Yeah, let's stay an extra day. And back and forth, and went to visit this other house. Walked in there, and completely different vibe. You know, you get that sort of spidey sense. The hairs go up on the back of your neck. You see the way individuals are looking at you.
I'm intimately familiar with the feeling.
And again, the training kicked in. I was like, I'll tell you what, I need to go back, get something from the hotel. Let me know when these guys turn up, and we will view these tapes, and we'll do a deal. Went back, grabbed the stuff from the hotel, and within 20, 30 minutes, we're on the road and heading our way back to Kabul. And at that time, there's a period of the desert, or there's a period of the road, which again is bandit country. You don't want to be caught out there at night. You will get robbed. There's a good chance that you could get shot. So our plan was, right, we're going to drive as far as we can to this point, and then we're going to right turn out into the desert, half a mile off the road, and we'll just sleep for a few hours in the desert until sun comes up, and it's safe then to carry on back to Kabul. Hoping that nobody's chasing us out of Kandahar or following us. So we're doing that. No one's following us. We did a couple of kind of surveillance loops and sort of made sure no one was tailing us. And we're coming into this last village where a lot of the truckers kind of stop for the night so they don't get robbed as they go through the Badlands.
Always a good idea to follow those patterns of life.
Yeah, and we're driving through, and I'm telling Asaf, my driver, I said, keep going. And all of a sudden, at the corner of my eye, I see this white face and a baseball cap. So I tell the driver, slow down a minute. And then all of a sudden, there's, again, this white flash of this face on the driver's side. He's got his window down. And this hand comes through the window with this Russian passport. And
not something you expect to see there.
And again, I react in a certain way instinctively, and then realize that, okay, there's no threat here. We come to a stop, and there's these two, one's 20, one's 21, Russian hitchhikers that had they were computer engineer graduates taking a year off from school to go hitchhiking around Asia.
They're in the wrong part of Asia. I hope they realized at that moment.
So this story and this day had now just taken on a very bizarre twist in the sense that, okay, guys, you know where you are, don't you? I said, Russia, Afghanistan. not a great history. I said, you're hitchhiking up and down the road shortly after major conflict.
Yeah, insane.
Yeah, and they realized that they were probably not going to make it through the night, and were practically begging us to give them a lift back to Kabul. So I was like, yeah, come on, jump in. So now there's me, driver, fixer translator, and these two Russian kids, and we're driving out into the desert.
Who had no idea the favor you just did them.
Yeah, and their English wasn't great. So when we stopped, they kind of looked at us quizzically, and they thought, oh, had they literally jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire?
Mm-hmm.
Again, we sort of got across to them that, no, we're just going to stop for a few hours and rest, which we did. And we got ourselves safely on to Kabul. And then within a few hours, I got a flight from Kabul to Islamabad, Dubai, London, and then London to Atlanta. And I arrived Sunday evening with these bundle of VHS tapes. And that's how I arrived here in Atlanta from Afghanistan, and kind of set me on a path to becoming a U.S. citizen.
And so you're still working for CNN in Atlanta now?
I've actually moved through 2 different jobs since then.
Okay.
They are Turner Broadcasting is an actual client of mine, so we do all of their travel assistance, and we still do look after their journalists overseas. But we
getting back to the family roots a little bit.
Yeah, so we do look after the wider organization. So I have everything from Cartoon Network and the executives, including CNN, that we look after, but then not as intimately as I once did. No.
Sure. So what? We finally get to talk about your upcoming adventures here. But what has and to get to that, it's the Talisker Whisky Atlantic Challenge. But you'll be rowing across the Atlantic Ocean this year or into 2019, I guess, with the timing of when that happens. But and we can talk about that a little bit. But what has kind of led you towards this challenge that you've got coming up?
Yeah, so I think we can go back. First of all, I just told you other than my military service, and as like I said, there's lots of stories from that. My big civilian start was that story back in 2002, and every 10 years I seem to go off and do something crazy. My 2012 crazy escapade was actually taking a CNN team into Homs, Syria during the siege, into actual Bab al-Amma, and that's a whole different episode just in that there. And this one is now kind of not quite 10 years, but close to it. And my wife has said that, yeah, every 10 years or so, she lets me go off and do something crazy. And this one is more purposeful, and hopefully will have a lot bigger impact in its final iteration. And as you pointed out, I'm going to be rowing 3,000 nautical miles, which is about 3,200 normal miles, from La Gomera in the Canary Islands, which are just off the north coast of Africa, across the Atlantic to Antigua by myself in a little 22-foot rowing boat. It is a specialized ocean rowing boat, but a small boat all the same. And I decided to do this. If we were to go back 2 years when everyone was doing the 22 push-up challenge, one of those viral kind of tag a friend, do a worthy sort of cause, trying to bring some awareness to a particular cause. And in this case, it was to raise awareness in terms of the 22 former servicemen that were taking their own lives through PTS, the effects of traumatic brain injury, many different reasons why people were taking their own lives. So I was caught up in that. I was doing my 22 push-ups a day, filming it, posting it on social media and tagging friends. It was around about that time I reconnected with an old friend of mine that was on the Marines boxing squad. And we sort of chit-chatted back and forth during that period over social media. And it was great to sort of relive those old days. Well, it was about 8 weeks later, I came to learn that he took his own life. And he had been suffering from PTS pretty badly. I certainly didn't know. He didn't let on to me that he was struggling. And that kind of stayed with me. More so, I wouldn't say that I had been close to this guy. We were, again, brothers in arms. We'd been on the boxing squad together, but we hadn't really connected for about 25 years until a couple of months before. And I wanted to do more. So me and a couple of friends tried to take that whole concept of 22 push-ups and what that initial campaign was trying to do. And we had one of us doing push-ups with the sea lions in the Georgia Aquarium. We were planning to get some drones and some other production people and a load of soldiers and Air Forcemen out of Dobbins and make good use of the Atlanta FC practice grounds near here and have this big extravaganza and then cut in with some interviews of family members and everything else. Well, it was all set to go down, and then there was some sort of weather event that took place in Atlanta that time, and it kind of stopped the filming, and then life got in the way. Everyone went off their separate ways, and it stuck with me, and it was one of those itches that you just couldn't scratch. I thought, I feel like I should be doing more. How can I do more? I was a little bit lost. And I had another friend who was rowing across the Atlantic as a team of 6 from mainland Europe to mainland Latin America. And I'd been following them online and just playing around with Google. I'd come across the Talisker Whisky Atlantic Challenge and saw that you could do it as a pair, like 2 rowers in a boat, as well as solos, 3s, 4s, and 5s. Did a bit of research. I thought, this is great. This is the perfect platform from which to raise awareness, raise a bit of support and funds, and hopefully have the impact that I'm looking for. So I reached out to my friend and asked him. I said, "Hey, I've come across this race. Great charitable platform for fundraising. Would you be interested to join me and we'll row across together?" And he looked back at me. He was like, "Hell no! You gotta be crazy. I'm not going to do that." And I was like, "Oh, okay. I didn't think it was that bad, but I kind of thought, well, I either have to let it go, or I could do it as a solo." And that's what I decided. I thought, right, I know physically and somewhat mentally, I could get myself from one side of the Atlantic to the other. What I've found, it's quite tough to set up a campaign and actually get ourselves to the start line. But the impact that we hope to have and where this campaign has started to grow means that it's going to be so much more than just a row or a race across the Atlantic. It will hopefully lead to a lot bigger and better things that will help not just veterans here in North America, but potentially internationally in the UK and Australia.
Sure. And I think that when it comes to veteran suicide, and the effect of post-traumatic stress and the effect of traumatic brain injuries, it's something that affects many, many, many people in the military, being most people that I've spoken to in the military are only 1 or 2 degrees of separation away from having contact with a veteran or service member suicide. And I'm sure with your experience, having spoken to someone so close to when they took their life and not having seen signs or symptoms, there's difficulty in that, right? Because with so many shared experiences and so much shared background, there's a couple of concerns. Number one, if these people have had the same experiences as you and take their own life, what risk are you at? Like what risk are any of us that have had combat experience and experienced traumatic stress? There's some fear associated with, how has this affected me permanently? But also, how, if you have so much in common, could you not see those signs and not get to someone in time to have an impact? That sticks with you for a while. And the desire to never have that happen again and to be able to make the kind of impact or reach out in the kind of way where you don't, I guess, you limit the opportunity to miss the shot like that again. There's a strong desire to have that happen. I know of 2 people that I spoke to as well. One a couple of months prior to a suicide, and one a couple of months prior to an accident based on some irresponsible and reckless patterns of life after multiple deployments where traumatic stress and traumatic brain injury was a factor. And in both instances, the overwhelming feeling is looking back and wondering what the possibilities of things that could have gone different were to prevent that kind of tragedy. And I think that's a common sentiment and a driving factor looking forward and what the possibilities are for preventing those kinds of tragedies in the future.
Yeah. Obviously, in my own research, I'm not someone that knows all the sort of facts and figures. Like you said, I've come into this from the emotional side when I've come across those that I feel that have been close to me that have suffered. Even this just past weekend, Friday morning, I wake up again. You regularly look at your phone, and after checking emails, you move on to social media and see a stream of nonsense from someone that, again, I looked up to, I served with, and is contemplating taking their own life. That's not the way that you want to wake up on a morning. So yes, it is sad to say that we probably all know someone, not 6 levels removed. It's probably 1 or 2.
Sure.
We don't have to sort of search far to find someone that is either suffering from or have experienced someone taking their own life as a result. So I think that initial kind of highlight those 2 years ago has moved things along some degree. But in this day and age, with so many great groups out there, more should be done to help address this earlier on in the process. And there should be less reliance on medication and just the sort of the traditional forms that perhaps worked in, I don't want to sort of stereotype from civilian life to military life, but with smaller groups that are perhaps suffering from, yes, equal high stress events or traumatic events, there's a different flavor to them, and they need to be addressed in a different way. But now the sheer volume, we've got to look at different ways in which you can pre-screen, you can provide alternative interventions sooner in the process.
The earliest identification of factors that could lead to someone going down that road of suicidal ideation, because so much of that is about personal connection, and identification of risk is about personal connection, because you hear over and over and over again anecdotally, I didn't see any signs. And generally people that are suffering are not forthcoming with their suffering. And so it's that human connection that is the biggest factor in identification. Because without that human connection, someone who's suffering does not realize the available help,
Yeah. And that's sort of where my campaign has sort of morphed into. And it's morphed into only fairly recently. When I first had the idea of rowing by myself across the Atlantic, it was really, and if you visit the website and check out the initial story, it's like, okay, I had a charity in the UK and a charity here. I'm from the UK. I'm now living in the US. I'm a holder of both a British and an American passport. So it was this crossing the Atlantic, both sides, being a veteran and so forth. But someone came to me and said, well, that's great. And hopefully you'll raise a lot of money. But then what? The problem's not going to be solved from what you're doing or the 1,000 other events that people are doing around the country and across the globe to address this. If you want to really have some impact, consider this. So we've now developed this 3-phase initiative, and it's going to start with the rowing sort of campaign to really start the conversation again, bring the awareness back out into the open, and hopefully create some noise around it that we can get others around it and sort of speaking about the issues again. And then from there, the idea is to use technology, a mobile app, like you said, to create those human touch points. The app is called Connect, and it really does what it says on the side of the tin. And that's to connect those that perhaps haven't seen each other for 20 years and just want to reconnect. Okay, some could say that you've got social media for that. But if you've got all of the big military colleges, West Point, Air Force Academy, Naval Academy, the Citadel, all these others that provide this app for their alumni, now you can stay connected. And there's probably others out there. But then if you have people leaving a unit, getting reintegrated into civilian life, and they move perhaps for work to another city that they don't know anywhere, that they're unfamiliar with, they can go on the app just in the same way as you can go onto some of these coffee apps and say, hey, there's such and such from my old unit here. Let me reach out and contact them. So you're creating those human elements. But more importantly, we're going to create this connected network with those that can provide clinical help, whether it's through the VA, whether it's through nonprofits, in the same manner. So if you're feeling a little bit down or you're suffering for whatever reason, you can also go in and say, here's someone that perhaps I can talk to, and get beyond some of the stigma of, I'm this big, tough Marine or Special Forces operator, but you're not
trained to ask for help coming from those roles.
Exactly. So we're trying to break down some of those barriers to being able to reach out for help. So you can reach out to your old battle buddies, or you can reach out to professionals, you can reach out to others, and it's about connecting those that have a need with those that can provide some sort of support.
Sure.
And then once we've got that education piece built into it, the third piece hopefully will be to build into the app some way of providing tools for all of those same people. Not to pre-screen, because we're not clinicians. We're not someone who's going to start to say, oh, that person's got problems. No, we're going to look for those warning signs. We're going to look for those red flags. Be able to ask the right sort of questions. And then if you've got someone talking, connect them back into those that can provide the right help.
Sure.
And so the idea is hopefully to sort of create a like a mentoring.
I love the idea of
the
staged
network.
involvement too, because just getting the app is step one, and that's not a difficult step for people to take, even if they're suffering, right? Finding some friends that are on there is also not that difficult of a step, but each one of them is a step towards the most important step in this process, which is saying, will you help me to someone else? You know, I'm hurting, I'm suffering, I need help. Will you be the person that helps me? Which is the most difficult step, the most difficult question to ask, coming from an environment where it is quite literally, in some senses, beat into you that you must be strong, capable, hardy, and not weak in any way. You know, this is the environment that you're coming from. Saying, I am experiencing weakness and suffering, and I need help from someone else is an extremely daunting prospect, and in many cases feels like a failure in and of itself. To ask for that help, and I think that's the biggest hurdle to get over. And so kind of having that platform and those steps that break down that barrier to asking for help is incredibly important.
Because I think people are looking for those opportunities. I would say 2 or 3 months ago, I had people, and it's happened I think on 4 separate occasions, people, veterans, reach out to me via kind of either direct or private messages through our various sites, saying, hey, I'm struggling at the moment. I was thinking about taking my life today, came across this, I'm reconsidering. Please, thank you. And I haven't done anything yet. I haven't really pushed out the site or the real message. It was still
nor if you wrote a stroke.
And I haven't wrote a stroke. Again, at the time, I'm still trying to pull in sponsorship. So some could say that perhaps I've already helped 4 people. Like you said, and I haven't done anything. And that's just me.
And that's a testament to what just putting a data point in someone's social media feed or whatever it is that can get someone who's suffering to pause for one moment and think. The campaigns like this have an impact because it causes that exact reaction. You know, someone stops and says, you know, they might think there's a lot going on with this. Maybe I should take a look at this video or read this caption, and it causes that pause, and that pause may be the thing that matters.
Yeah. So I think in its simplest form, once we get the conversation started again, the ability to connect, and again, it's not just people, but if we can connect other like-minded organizations that are all locally doing great work. But if you can now start to connect all of these smaller local efforts with some sort of national or international initiative, even if it's, like you said, just awareness, how much of a force multiplier that becomes.
Sure.
Why it hasn't been done previously, I'm somewhat amazed. But if we can advance that in some way and get closer to that ultimate aim and have a positive impact, then I may have been able to sort of partly scratch that itch.
No, that's it's definitely a noble endeavor. That's for sure. And so to find a little bit more about the rowing event specifically, folks can take a look at your website, right? Yep.
So at the moment, we've got our first website up there, which is tamethekraken.com. We are changing it to a .org to make it a little bit more non-profit specific. Mm-hmm. We are a non-profit. We are a 501c3. So any donations are welcomed and appreciated, and obviously tax deductible. We are also linked to theunseenwounds.org.
Okay.
Which sort of gives a little bit more background to the 3 phases that I just spoke of, and that's ultimately where we'll continue to push the efforts through, both prior and after my row across the Atlantic. And then obviously we have all the various social media platforms out there. You can find us on Tame the Kraken on Facebook and Instagram, or Row Atlantic on Twitter. So you can get to, they're all linked. You can get to one or t'other through either one of those. And we also have a GoFundMe out there called Tame the Kraken.
Okay. Well, that's, and I obviously encourage anyone who feels, who feels called to try and make any kind of impact on veteran suicide, to visit your website at Tame the Kraken, and tamethekraken.com, and tamethekraken.com/sponsorship is where that's that information about different sponsorship levels for your row across the Atlantic are, and that's, I think, probably the best place for people to figure out how they can get directly involved with you, right?
That's right, yeah. And again, we would love to have a few more corporate sponsors on board. This is a fairly expensive endeavor. While it is still a challenge, and it's not risk-free, the Atlantic is never a place where it's calm and collected the entire time. It's pretty rough out there. The boat and everything that goes into it is incredibly safe, and it's safe, obviously, to get all the rowers across. But with a certain amount of safety comes expense. So obviously, what we want to try and do is cover all of the operational expenses through sponsorship, and then all of our fundraising can go to the charities directly. So we can have a clean break between what it's going to cost to get to the start line and get across versus the impact that we can have through the fundraising. And obviously, we can cover the operational costs quickly and early, the more we can devote to fundraising activities.
Sure.
And I'm happy to load up the rowing erg in the back of the car and come visit you, and we can do corporate events, we can do fundraisers, we can do fun events. And obviously once we've got the boat back here, be on the back of a trailer, we're more than likely come visit all of our sponsors and do some sort of corporate day with them, whether it's on the water or just at their location. So we're invested, and we want all of our sponsors to be part of the team.
Oh, I think that would be really cool as well. It's the boats. So I'm sure, anybody can go to Talisker Whisky Atlantic Challenge.com, or just search for this and see what some of these boats look like. They almost look like a little missile, and they're because they have little covered sections. About the covered sections seem like they're about the size of a bathtub. The kind of interior sections for storage and everything. They have solar panels, and these things are really purpose built for getting across the ocean with oars. So that there's definitely some neat opportunities to see what that equipment looks like and get involved, and as a corporate sponsor, and do things that can drive some engagement there for sure.
Yeah, and again, the crossing is not a quick crossing, relatively speaking. Prior to this year's race that just finished, the world record for a solo was 35 days. Whereas the average crossing for the 2 years prior to that was around about 52 days. I had initially set myself a target of 50 days or less, and a lot of it depends on the weather.
Sure.
This year, the weather was, perfect.
It's a record year in 2017 for the race, right?
Yeah, the weather was perfect. All the winds were strong, but they were all lined up perfectly. So the boats got blown from the Canary Islands to Antigua in short order, and I think the solo world record got broken by almost 5 days, which is just phenomenal. And especially when you put it into perspective of the 27, 28 boats that started. Mark Slatz, who was the solo winner, was fourth overall, and the 3 boats in front of him were 4-man crews.
That's pretty amazing.
The second solo rower was 1,000 miles behind him. So the guys are he's just an animal. So that's
just insane to think about. Yeah, you beat the second place solo rower by 1,000 nautical miles.
Yeah. the second guy came in 14 days after him.
That's amazing.
So
is he? You going to get some tips and tricks from him for this year's race?
I am. Yeah, he's just finishing up with the Dutch. He's a big Dutch guy. So he just finished up with the Dutch boat show over the weekend, and then he and I will hopefully sit down and be able to sort of dive a little bit deeper into how he managed kind of to maintain that sort of effort.
Planning, routines, fitness, all of those things.
That's like 18, 20 hours worth of rowing a day.
Every day.
For 30 days. That's
remarkable. Remarkable is a bit of an understatement, but that's remarkable.
Yeah. So there are a lot of unknowns at this stage. Like on my list, I know we'd spoken about it a little bit yesterday, kind of like the day in the life. It is all about routine. Coming from the military, obviously we love routines. We thrive off them. The only thing obviously we don't have control of is the weather. So you've got to try to build routines into routines to accommodate for whatever the weather is getting thrown at you. But the idea is, as a solo rower, you have a little bit more flexibility, but when you're not rowing, essentially you're not going forward. Mm-hmm. Whereas all the other teams, whether you're a two-person team or a four-person team, even a six-person team, I think is entered into my race, you're always going to have half the team rowing.
Sure.
So there's always someone on the oars. So if there's two of you, one person's resting, one person's rowing. And I think that's a big difference between the level of challenge between the teams and the solo rowers. And prior to Mark this year, you would normally see a kind of a demarcation between the way those cross the finish line. Mm-hmm. But Mark just smashed it.
Bit of an anomaly.
Yeah.
And there's challenge in being alone. That's its own separate challenge as well.
It is, and everyone has sort of said it goes through phases. Like you got 3,000 nautical miles to play with, and everyone says it's the first few days are the hardest because you're getting used to being out on big sea and seasickness. It doesn't matter if you're a hardy, salty sea dog. You're in a little tiny boat, literally like a cork on the water, getting tossed around. So you're having to try and row as well as keep your food down and maintain a certain energy level. Then after about 3, 4, 5 days, sleep deprivation starts to kick in and never goes away. And there's some interesting stories of people seeing zombies come out.
I've read that story.
And some great stories as to some of the hallucinations that people have.
What did he say? A zombie reached up out of the water and tried to grab his oar?
Yeah.
And this is the same solo rower who won, correct? That was talking about this? Or was...
Yeah. And then, again, you've got the weather. So you've got... you're all kind of North Africa, crossing the equator, Caribbean. So up into the high 80s, 90s, if not higher, in terms of heat. So you've got sunstroke, heat stroke, dehydration. You will get splashed all the time. And as that stuff dries out, essentially it's like a salt scrub. Mm-hmm. So you get salt rashes and sores on your skin that never heal up, blisters, all the sort of physical wear and tear on your body, and you can't sort of just I'll take today off. You just got to keep going.
A day off is another day at sea.
Yeah. So it is accumulative, and as you pass through one phase, you pass into another phase, and what I've been told, you get to that kind of 2/3 of your way through, and now you're counting down. More so than when you cross the halfway mark. You get to that last 1,000 miles, and it goes from triple digits from 4 digits into triple digits, and you can almost smell those sort of Caribbean islands.
Sure.
And it is now by sheer willpower that you're going. You're getting tendinitis. Your hands are in bad shape. You're getting real bad sort of sores on your backside, and you're having to MacGyver your way through the setup of your seat. And this is obviously without any mechanical breakdown, where your water.
This is assuming no major injuries. Yeah, exactly.
And getting capsized, all those sort of things that can mess with your day.
Yeah.
So it's a constant battle.
Yeah, and I don't think I'm going to let you get away without coming back on afterwards and telling us what it was like. We'll have to hear that story for sure. Yeah. But I've got some ideas with some folks I'd love to connect you with through people that I've come across that I think would be very interested in this and getting involved. And hopefully what we can do is maximize the exposure, because obviously this cause is something that has come into the forefront of social media and other media outlets more recently, but it's one that is it seems almost rampant and out of control, the veteran suicide problem, and doing something big to raise awareness is I think absolutely necessary that things like this continue to happen because of how important it is.
Yeah, and again, it's about changing the narrative. We get to hear about it in mainstream media when something bad happens, when a bad report comes out from the VA. Why can't we start to change that narrative? Look at this great research. Look at the information that we found out that is impacting things in a meaningful way,
sure.
and moving those numbers in a positive direction.
And look at these organizations that are creating the positive connections and effectively reducing this issue.
Exactly. And again, the more that we can look at alternative treatment techniques and all of these sort of things, it's because they're out there.
Sure.
And those are the sort of conversations that we can have to get those that need the treatment connected with those that can offer it, and to have, like I said, a more positive narrative. Do we think it's going to be cured overnight? Of course not. But let's take those incremental steps in a positive direction and not have to revisit this time and time again.
Sure. And I think that's a great point to wrap up on for today. And I think it's definitely worth mentioning that if someone is listening to this that is struggling, there are some immediate resources. 1-800-273-8255. 800-273-TALK is the U.S. suicide hotline, and if you press 1 there, you get the veteran-specific line. Samaritans.org in the UK is one of the primary suicide prevention organizations, and with any number of ways to contact that organization. And then in Australia, 131114 is the number 24 hours a day for that suicide hotline. And so those are 3 major organizations in 3 different countries that address this. And the issue is one of extreme tragedy, and I think one of the most worthwhile causes to get behind. And I really appreciate you taking 2.5 hours of your day and coming on and talking to us and telling your story of service, and then why and how you're involved with this cause now. Tim, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, and again, thank you to your listeners. Hopefully they found it interesting, maybe funny at some points, but like you said, let's wrap it up with the real reason why I'm doing this. I'm sure there'll be some highs and lows when crossing it, but again, I will keep with me the thought that there's probably someone out there that's having a worse day, and that's why I'm doing it.
Absolutely. And you'll have good days and bad days on the boat, but every bad day on the boat may be serving to prevent the worst kind of day for someone out there who's struggling. So
absolutely.
Well, thanks for coming on, and we look forward to following the journey and also talking to you after you've completed the row.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening to episode 8 of the podcast. Again, if you'd like to get involved and support Tim, go to tamethecracken.com. Kraken is Kraken, or just Google his name. It's the top result. His most immediate challenge is getting to the start line, and what he needs is funding. He also has links with options to donate directly to the charities he's raising awareness for, as well as options to donate to support his participation in the Talisker Whisky Atlantic Challenge. Tim doesn't just plan to complete the journey, he plans to win the race as well. See you next week.